Hannah, thanks so much for starting this up. Congratulations. Very good. Been waiting, I guess, since I came here in 2004 for something like this to keep going. I have many of Piero's other meetings in the Bay Area, so nice to see you again. So this is going to be sort of slightly different. So I guess on the interaction between art and science, my experience of it tends to err on the art side. So this is going to be a little more on the science side. And over a period of about 20 years, I was able to co-opt an artist to do some science. So that's part of the story. But it's really a concern that I've come to. There's a problem I want to talk about, hidden fragility. And maybe editorialize a little bit about this data deluge, so-called big data. That we're sort of hearing about, being swept aside by. So the concern comes from many years of studying complex, nonlinear, unpredictable, chaotic systems. And then kind of stopping and looking out at the world that we're building in the last, I don't know, decade, 2 decades. Actually, we've been doing this for a pretty long time, but particularly concerned of what I've seen recently. So in particular, thinking about us as smart little critters trying to understand our world and then using what we understand about the world to build systems that feed us, that defend us, that entertain us, and realizing that as we build these more sophisticated social technical systems, we're actually building systems that are exquisitely sensitive to their own spontaneous and emergent destruction. And so I want to talk a little bit about how I think about that problem. So that's kind of the picture I've come to. It maybe sounds a little dire. The middle of the talk will be extremely dire, because I'm going to give you a particular example that will connect up actually to insects. So I'll make a few connections. But it's just, yeah, so I'm pondering this. So the talk is a position statement with a few hints, and I'll even come back to tie in with the visualization system that Meredith and Jordan were talking about as a possibly constructive tool for dealing with these very complicated systems. So, gosh, make your own favorite list. Just in the last 20 years, there have been all these amazing disasters. Well, Tuesday is one of them, right?
Yeah.
Talk about sensitive dependence on initial conditions. There's one guy who's worried about his career and his position, and he's willing to screw the entire country. Unbelievable. But interesting from an academic point of view. I don't know. In fact, I've even kind of forgotten that every decade there are 3 or 4 major power outages, and as we all know, that the lights are on, the projector's running, because in the western United States, we are part of a massive, many multi-thousand-mile interconnected electric grid that consists of power stations, hydro plants, substations, and massive power transmission lines. And there are these failures, massive, huge failures. I don't know if anyone remember, but it was back in the late 80s in Oregon. A tree fell over and knocked one transmission line down, and it took out the power for over half a day of 1/3 of the entire West Coast. It affected here and all the way up into Washington State. So, picture here, small event, takes out a power transmission line. Sometimes the operators respond, sometimes it's automated. They go, oh, I can't send this much power over here. That's fine, I'll shift it over to these other lines. Well, if enough power was going on the previous line, it can overload this line, and so that line goes down. And then they shift the power over here, and those lines go down. Those are called cascading failures. They're endemic to the structure of how our power grids are engineered. So that's a simple one. But there are lots of others. Black Monday, probably forgotten now. Back in the Reagan era, global stock market crash. was a result of a technical innovation, how they came up with this great idea as a hedge fund when you put your different commodities and stocks and equity pieces together in this hedge where these different pieces balance off against each other. There's still risks, and so they thought, oh, we can get people, make another sort of financial instrument that will insure against the whole portfolio going down. But then it turned out those were actually, people were investing in those that had already invested in the original portfolio, so there was a feedback loop, and so there was a very large global stock market crash due to that kind of technical innovation. Long-term capital management, starting with $5 billion in hedge funds, and the top economists put together this hedge fund, LTCM. They leveraged a $100 billion portfolio by borrowing money, except that in all their very sophisticated statistical analysis, they assumed something called liquidity, that if one component of the portfolio went down, they could sell it to balance the changes in the rest of the portfolio. Well, it turned out there was a small glitch in the gold spot market in Russia at the time, and it turned out there was another commodity they couldn't sell because the market was too small. There was a lack of liquidity, or what we say in mathematics, their assumption in their statistical analysis, independent, identically distributed processes, didn't hold. And this caused a cascading failure. We didn't hear too much about that because, in fact, the feds came in and it cost about $600 billion of our dollars to bail them out. But the feds were scared to death that the entire world market would go down. Okay, at this point, in fact, this slide is kind of old. These are really old, uninteresting examples, right? We now are so used to these massive screw-ups, right? Mm-hmm. These are old. Collapse of the airline industry because of what? And then 2 towers going down, okay, but then suddenly everyone's afraid, security, so on. Bankruptcies of Enron and WorldCom, they were the largest corporate failures at the time in the early aughts. They're nothing compared to what we went through in fall of 2008. In fact, through my previous association with something called the Santa Fe Institute, I was on Wall Street talking to these people in the fall of 2007. And those people were ashen-faced. These are, professional people, most of them billionaires, the biggest banks, and they wanted to hear what I had to say. They thought I could help them with policy decisions on how to dig themselves out of this. And they knew what was coming. Stupid me, I didn't know why they were so concerned. I don't really care about money, the economy. These guys were scared if I could have read them right at that time. And they completely predicted what was going to happen a year later. They knew how the credit was going to lock up. And they didn't see a way out of it. Why they came to me, I don't know. They were really scared, I guess. Pandemic spread of disease, right? So H1N1, SARS. Here we are now with these large agricultural businesses. Think of China, all the pork and chickens that are raised there, but then that gets coupled to people traveling there, traveling back on the airline, this global transportation system we have, and suddenly the inherent dynamics of disease spreads changed. Of course I like to fly, be able to fly anywhere on the planet, and I like chicken and pork, but you put those two systems together and suddenly you've got connected networks where failure in one can transmit into another one, not just stay within an electrical power grid. And then we are interconnecting all these systems together. Electrical power grid, well, someone had this great idea that they'd like to control the electrical power grid, but from their laptop. So what used to be controlled with a special protocol called SCADA, which is on the high tension power lines, gets transmitted, open the weirs in the dam, shut the power line, the transmission lines here, turn on the coal-fired power plant, shut down the gas-fired plant. That's all done with SCADA, and that's all internal to the wiring. We have wires between all these things because it's carrying electrical power. There's digital control. Somebody got the great idea that it should also be accessible from the internet. So one day, one of my students who was in computer science studying networking came to my house and said, "Jim, look at this." This is Sean, who wrote the network visualization software you just saw. Flips up his laptop, and he's sort of famous for being able to hack into everything. Anyway, eventually, a screen pops up and he says, "Oh, see these levers here? If I hit those, I'm going to open up a weir and hedgy down in the dam." He was studying SCADA and its vulnerabilities. So these days, when you hear someone talk about the smart grid, Obama talks about EARPA and trying to make a smart grid. What they're really talking about is securing the damn thing. Just that. Right now, you can go hook into high-powered tension lines, pull out the SCADA protocol, and inject your own commands and control all sorts of things. It's extremely vulnerable. That should probably not go on the internet. So, now these recent flash crashes, again, okay, I'm kind of going on here. I mean, there really is this bestiary of these catastrophes, and so after a while I got to thinking, wow, these are, they're not going away. Maybe as a child I think, oh, we get smarter, the world gets safer, we understand how to control nature. The problem is us, because then, from what we know, we build larger social technical systems and we connect them together. So what's going on? I mean, I don't think this list was going to stop. Right? So what's going on? So this is kind of what I'm labeling hidden fragility. We build these systems. They are sort of distributed, very large-scale systems, many, many components. Each is sort of active, maybe in different domains, the internet, financial networks, agribusiness. Then we interconnect them, and then individually on their own network, they do some interesting functioning. They're supposed to have useful emergent properties. But then when we couple those things together, we can't predict how they're going to behave. Will they stabilize each other? Will they cause each other to go unstable? So that's my concern. And the puzzle in this is that the way they behave in time, they sort of organize themselves in ways that we can't anticipate. So that's the hidden part of the hidden fragility. Fragility is these things can have inherent instabilities, vulnerabilities. What worries me is that kind of naively, as we put these things together, you think, oh, I built the system, I know how it works. Well, no, that's actually my business. I've been working in chaos and nonlinear dynamics for 30 and 40 years, and the main lesson there is, even if you write down the equations of motion, you design the system, you know what the forces are, how they're coupled together, what the balance of forces is, you can't predict. The system might be inherently unpredictable. That's even true for simple systems like a pendulum. It can be chaotic. Now we're building these massive, massive systems. So it's a big problem. And not all negative, right? I'm kind of talking about catastrophes just to be a little dramatic. Sometimes they're a massive reorganization of our social technical networks that are really positive, like the emergence of microelectronics. That requires the coordination of very many different networks, commerce, investment, materials, smarts. So not all negative, but it's still, there are these vulnerabilities. So let me drill down. So this is a particular example I've worked on. And this is actually the art connection. Let's see if you get the art connection. Behold the bark beetle, the pine bark beetle bugs. They're about the size of a grain of sand. There are many different species, and the different species are co-adapted to different kinds of pine tree, to say it simply. In New Mexico, in the Santa Fe Institute, there are pinyon trees, and then there's the Ips confusus bark beetle. If you're in British Columbia, there's the mountain pine beetle. And they spend most of their life actually inside a tree. They dig nests, they reproduce inside a tree, and then just in the spring, they sort of come out, they have to find, the young ones have to come find a new tree. So this is a little critter, very small. Now what I'm showing you is the northern American continent and a piece of British Columbia, and all the red dots here are pieces, large regions of the ponderosa forest that have been killed by the largest insect outbreak ever documented due to the mountain pine beetle. In fact, for years, you can still do this, you can go into Google Earth, and I just urge you to fly on Google Earth up to British Columbia, Yukon Territories, and Alaska. Depends a little bit on when the actual satellite images were put into the database, what you're going to see. But you'll see huge red blotches between a gray blotch and a green blotch. Green blotch is healthy ponderosa pine. Gray blotch are the tree carcasses left over. And the red is this very short period of time where the bark beetles, by infecting the tree, cut off the vascular system, basically, and starve the tree, and then the needles go from green to red, and then fall off. So you can see huge areas of this. So what? Well, Canadians are at least concerned about it. It hasn't been too newsworthy in the US, but here's just a few quotes from ecologists and forest entomologists. This looks like something new happening on a huge scale. It's a sudden shift into a new kind of forest condition. We're seeing this pine beetle do things that have never been recorded before. They're attacking younger trees and attacking timber in altitudes they've never been before. So, in fact, this slide's a few years old. Even then, more so now. Bark beetles are now the largest agent of change in North American forests. They annually, in Canada, one of their big exports, timber. Timber industry is really concerned up there. The bark beetles annually kill twice as many trees as the entire forestry industry. The tree loss in British Columbia, here's another calibration, just that alone offsets Canada's commitment to CO2 carbon reductions in the Kyoto Protocol. You have a tree, it sequesters carbon. Good. Kill it, it stops doing that, it falls over, and it releases carbon. Double whammy. If you integrate the effect of this one British Columbia infestation, 327,000 square kilometers as of 3 years ago, you integrate that up to 2020, it completely offsets Canada's commitment to carbon reductions through the Kyoto Protocol. That's the size of this. Remember, these things are the size of a piece of rice. It's a huge outbreak. So what's going on? So let me not go on too long about this. This is kind of the quick jump to the punchline, and a little bit about the way we've been studying this. So the connection here is that, to the arts, is that with a composer, natural sound, of course, David Dunn, who lives in Santa Fe, we were studying ultrasound for many years in natural environments, partly thinking in terms of some art installations where, you know, we all hear up to about 20 kilohertz. Well, there's a huge sound environment, acoustic, bio-acoustic environment out there, so we're wondering how to visualize that and make that present for people. So David hooked up, and he makes his own little ultrasound microphones, and he was out wandering around the forest around Santa Fe and heard this persistent ultrasound, about 150 kilohertz, way above what we hear, 150 to 300 kilohertz. So of course it's, well, that's from the stupid laptop with all its high frequency electronics. Nope, did test to get rid of that. At some point we were so desperate we thought, okay, Los Alamos National Lab is nearby. This must be some spooky thing they're doing up there. Or maybe even the harmonic convergence up in Taos, New Mexico. We don't know. But it turns out that when pine trees get drought stressed, they emit ultrasound. It took us 9 months to figure this out. And then, of course, when we find the literature, it's like, oh yeah, okay. Botanists knew this. I didn't, we didn't. And what's going on? So here's our kind of schematic picture that we kind of put together to at least try to get a handle on this multi-component system. So we have our bark beetles here. They live in trees. When the trees get drought stressed, it turns out the bark beetles have evolved an ultrasound communication system that they use for finding mates and reproducing. It's evolutionarily important to them. But it's also co-evolved so that they can find drought-stressed pine trees. Why? Well, because pine trees aren't silly. They've co-evolved with the bark beetles. Bark beetles are endemic. They've always been around. So when the new bark beetle comes out in the spring, it drills through the bark in the pine tree, and the pine tree has a vascular system that emits resin. Literally tries to pitch out, expel the bugs. If they're drought stressed, they don't have as much pitch, so they can't. So it's easier, the bark beetles have to invest less energy to making their nests, and therefore they can reproduce. So that's the kind of evolutionary story. Now what's going on, of course, is this is all in the climate. What's been going on with the climate recently? Well, the temperature is going up. That has an effect on the insects. Mean temperature's going up. Two things. First is, the growing season is now longer. The Ips confusus in Santa Fe, New Mexico used to reproduce every 2 years. It does it every summer now. The mountain pine beetle used to reproduce every year. It now reproduces twice a summer. Now, the winters are shorter, but they're also less severe. So the cold snaps the very, very cold weather that would kill off large fractions of the bark beetles living inside the tree aren't as effective anymore. So you have more bugs wintering over, and then they reproduce more quickly. So if you remember your Malthusian growth curves, you've changed the base and the exponent. And that's why there's this huge, huge growth. In addition, this is a different climate change effect, namely this very, very long-lived, and we're sort of in the middle of it still, drought that's affecting the Southwest. And by Southwest, I mean West Texas, Arizona, Utah, up through Montana, Washington State, all the way up to the Yukon Territory. Big swath. Think of that map I just showed you, which is stressing the forests. And it just so happens the bark beetles are sensitive to that because the drought-stressed trees emit ultrasound, which they can hear, and they know that's a good place to go. So this is a complex system. This sort of thing, I study physics. I study inanimate things that are really simple to understand. This is headache-inducing because I've got this bug that's small. Right? On this diagram, I have 8 orders of magnitude in scale, and in time, too. Small insects reproducing on the scale of months, trees forced to walk away on the scale of months. They can't walk away from the infestation. Forests move, well, not by kind of getting up and walking away, but by dying on the south end and growing on the north end. So these forests move in the scale of centuries. Climate actually spans a whole range of different time scales. So it's a hard system to think about. Most of the kinds of stability and instability analyses that I've been trained to do, we only deal with 1 or 2 time scales. This has many in it. So climate change. We can certainly do it. I can tell you how. But the interesting thing here is that so can insects. And kind of independent of how much, here's the kicker, we blame ourselves for screwing up the climate. We might have unleashed something that we have no control over. There weren't humans in this loop. As soon as things go unstable, they can stabilize into a new regime. So we kill off enough trees so that we release enough carbon so the climate starts changing faster, it gets hotter faster, and there are more droughts, which makes for more bugs that kill off more trees. That's why I want to understand the stability of this complicated system. I want to know, is this going to be some transient thing, or is it actually already sufficiently unstable to grow on its own? There is no known intervention for bark beetles. Not pesticides, not nothing. There was a large experiment done in the kind of forest, the border between Norway and Sweden about 15 years ago. They used these pheromone traps. That's the current theory of how bugs move through the world. It smells and pheromones. David Dunn and I actually have developed a theory that disagrees with that. We actually think it's acoustic communication through ultrasound. They put out pheromone traps. It actually tripled the size of the infestation. So there's really no other alternative except what we're currently proposing. We use sound. So in collaboration with a forest ecologist, entomologist down at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, we actually now have what's kind of the bark beetle equivalent of an ant farm. We have the phloem part of a tree between 2 pieces of plexiglass, and we can introduce bark beetles and watch them behave. And lo and behold, they use sound. We're still trying to figure out exactly what they're communicating. And if you actually put loud sound and play back their sounds to them, they'll actually start eating themselves. So there's a little bit of hope there. I'm not sure that we want to go out into the forest and put giant loudspeakers, but at least there's some natural and sort of non-toxic potential intervention. There's still a lot more research to do. So that's wild. Okay, so now I want to shift a little bit, and I'll just finish up real quickly because so that's kind of the general problem, hidden fragility. It's sort of all around us. We're making these systems, but even bugs can do it the natural world. These things can spontaneously appear. So what are we going to do about this? And that's sort of the challenge I see for myself. Is there some way to start thinking about these truly complex systems? How do we understand how they behave? Can we project? Can we see this hidden fragility and predict, and then maybe at some point come up with interventions? So one of the things that we're now, of course, dealing with is, in many different disciplines, from, the new social sciences, looking at Twitter data feeds, neurobiology, thousands of spike trains coming out from neural recordings, hundreds of distributed sensors on the San Andreas Fault. Letting us look at, we're awash in data. But that kind of begs the question, once you have the data, how do you understand what it is? How do you see these hidden scales, these emergent properties? Now, one answer is, hey, we have big computers. Let's build a model that has all the bells and whistles. All the little fault segments in the San Andreas Fault, internal mantle convection. Well, these machines are so big and powerful, and we can build now with really beautiful software tools, large software systems, and sort of manage these big models. The data they put out is almost as rich as any natural system. Begs the question, how do you understand this stuff? Is there some way that we can understand the mechanisms that produce emergent patterns, or even what pattern is itself, in a foundational enough way that I could teach a machine to go into the terabytes of data and find out these kind of hidden vulnerabilities, these risks, and so on. I, for one, don't want to go into a terabyte of data and figure these things out. I'm lazy. So this brings up the issue of tools, and you just saw one. So the room system, this immersive visualization, is sort of a piece of an answer to this question of hidden fragility. So this is kind of a larger picture. On the kind of mathematical front, most of my work is studying the question. If I'm looking at some data, usually the way we analyze these things is by having a model in our head. There's some data, like a physicist, what you do is, you think it's composed of frequencies. It's called Fourier analysis. You bring a model to the data you have, and you see how well that model resonates with the data. What we're trying to do is, does the data tell us itself how it should be represented? Does it tell us what its patterns are, so that we don't have to assume them, so that we can discover them? So that's the sort of mathematical side of this, and I have to say, over the many years, my interaction with artists have been critical to developing some of the philosophical thinking about this. Part of appreciating art is the piece sort of interests you, but you don't quite know what it is, and you come back and it keeps revealing itself. That's all part of this pattern discovery process. So there's been a very nice connection, even in the most abstract mathematical things I do, with talking with artists who are very sensitive to that in terms of how you present your ideas through a piece. So I'm also trying to develop sort of new set of classes and teaching methods, and also technologies for this macroscope. So Meredith and Jordan talked about the cave and the smaller version that we have. So in addition to the visualization part, what we're also doing is adding in very high performance supercomputing level simulation to look at these complex systems. And then, again, simulation's not enough, developing the tools. So here's Oliver that Jordan mentioned. He's the main software engineer for the cave, just showing you some more things like you saw with the Dream Vortex. Oliver playing with a large protein here, beta sheets, alpha helices. There are different modes you can look at these. Mycelia, we'll just step through this. This is the network simulation software by Sean Whalen. Again, you get as it's moving, you get some sense of the 3D, but that is almost entirely not the point. With these visualization systems, you get to walk through the data and look here and look there, which there's no way that the three of us can tell you what that's like. So you have to buttonhole us and make sure we take you to the cave, these simpler systems in my lab. Yeah, this is the network of Republican red and Democrat blue books in the 2008 election and how they cross-reference each other. And of course, the punchline is they don't talk to each other. So kind of. Let me just finish up here. So here we are, our happy little agents in our research-rich world that we're beginning to understand so well, but there's just kind of this exuberant plunge into building all these systems and connecting them all together. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. So I'm kind of position I'm taking here is that there's this natural consequence of this phenomenon still to be clearly articulated of hidden fragility. So I just think it's inevitable. So the question is, how much can we understand and predict about these systems and about the social dynamics? And I'm optimistic, despite the dire messages. I do think we can kind of stay ahead of these things, but we have to be more cognizant of what we're doing. We have to certainly train people to understand how complex systems form their patterns, have emergent patterns, and also can be vulnerable and unstable in a spontaneous way. Many of the metaphors we have now are centuries old and are inadequate to appreciating these things. Also, it's kind of the other extreme, of course, is then you come and you say, when you hear this on, I don't know, this or that new age radio program, everything is connected. Everything. It's like, no, that would be boring. If everything was connected, that would be really boring. There are limitations in how information flows in the world, and it's more subtle than that. Okay, so yeah, we need data, certainly simulation, but we also need, and I've written sort of ranting essays about this, I'm sort of feeling these days that sort of understanding, which I'm calling theory, is kind of getting squeezed out. The data deluge on one hand, giant computers on the other, and you have companies like Google. You might have noticed that this talk I gave 3 years ago at Google did not go over well. They like the data. They will not do simulation and modeling. They even have a Google prediction API that had no time series prediction.